Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Question of the Week. We received a thought provoking question from a listener. Can God use an unsaved person to bring about salvation? I think this is a fascinating topic that touches on how God's plan might work in ways we don't always expect, and I believe Chris does an excellent job on answering this important question. And enjoy the discussion.
Welcome to our question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
Hey, Chris. I had a question about, do you know where anywhere in the Bible where God uses somebody who appears not to be saved, like a Balaam or Judas or someone somewhere in there, that God uses them to save them, but but they're not saved?
Is there anywhere in the Bible where God uses someone to bring the gospel? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, that brings the gospel and God applies the word to save others, like when he did with Jonah when he spoke the word, or to Peter at Pentecost. There's parts in the Bible where it's pretty obvious that a prophet speaks and the word's applied. And we know Peter and Jonah were saved, but, could you ask the question that was Judas? Did Judas ever bring a word that God applied to someone's heart for salvation? Or Balaam or Solomon? The reason I'm asking this is because I may have incorrect understanding, but with the church age, say a pastor was not saved and they were being as faithful as possible as they could to the Bible, but they were not saved, could God still use that pastor to save someone in the congregation?
Well, yes, because, over the church age, there was partial understanding. They saw through a glass darkly. And so much of the church did not have, the entire church, even the elect within the church. This is pointed out in Isaiah 29, where there's a book that is sealed, and then it's presented to the learned, I think, and the learned says, well, I cannot read it because it's sealed. And then it's presented to the unlearned who cannot read it because he's unlearned. And that's telling, because the learned we can understand to be the wise and the unlearned the fool, saved and unsaved. And so over the course of the church age, the Bible was sealed, and the learned, the wise, couldn't read that portion of scripture that the Lord had sealed up for the reason it was sealed. And the unlearned, it was sealed to them. But the difference is, once it's unsealed, the learned can read it. He now has access and ability through salvation, but the unlearned still can't read it because he's still unlearned. Regardless of the time and season, for the unlearned, the Bible's a sealed book, or the equivalent of a sealed book, because he is unlearned. So even over the church age, the wise would have partial knowledge, partial understanding, and they would prophesy partially. What tends to happen in churches, and one of the reasons why God ended the church at the time of the end when he unsealed the scriptures, what tends to happen is there is a set of dogma, of doctrine, confessions, creeds, church, denominational positions. And men would rise up believing these positions, although different, church to church, and go to seminary, and they would often teach those positions. And it depends on the church, the degree of faithfulness over the course of the church age. And so in some ways, it could be a plus if you have an unsaved pastor, yet the unsaved pastor at that time would be obligated to teach certain doctrine because, this is what our church teaches. This is what our denomination teaches. And so it could be a church pattern after Calvin or, Luther or men who had partial understanding, partial knowledge of the doctrines of faith or election. They would teach, they would almost be obligated to teach. People would come to expect that teaching within that particular church. And really, the delivering of the word, that's what the preacher would do. He would deliver it, and the delivering of a sermon that is formed by these basic guidelines of doctrine and confession. The church father who taught election, the formation of the sermon and the delivering of the sermon is pretty much like, say, another man who's a faithful man who puts together a track and the information, and others hand out the track, although not all who distribute the track are saved. They're distributing information that was put together by others. And that is what many pastors would have done. It's what they would have learned in seminary. It's what they would have learned again in their denomination. This is our standard. This is what we're to follow. If they would go off course. Now what happened at the time of the end is God put up with the partial understanding or partial knowledge and the partial prophesying of the church for the church age. But at the end, his plan was to bring forth the fullness of the measure of truth or doctrinal teaching that the Lord intended for his people to know. And yet the church wasn't a proper vessel for that, because they had these strict guidelines they couldn't veer out of, and they were sort of locked into these things, which locked in high places. And so at the end, in our time period, God just couldn't use the church any longer, and he ended the church age.